All right, good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you in the name of all of our Dominican sisters to our Dominican Associate Formation Program. And we're so happy that you've chosen to share this special journey with us this year. We welcome also our associate candidates who are gathering with us on Zoom from Columbia, Missouri, from Peru, Illinois, Oglesby, and Wheaton, Illinois. Today, one of our associates has asked to bring a guest, so we are welcoming Marlene Lees and Jennifer Davids online too. They're waving, great. Candidates continue to be accepted through September, so our group may continue to grow. There are presently 10 associates in this year's class, and I'd like to introduce you to one another this morning. So if you would wave, raise your hand when I call your name. Keith and Lucinda Bisher, and they are here from Springfield. Cindy Gohl, who is here from Columbia, Missouri. Cindy just raised her hand online over there. Carol Haas from Peru could not be with us today. Oh, is Carol here? Carol is here, okay, all right. And Sue Ellen Kuntz in the back is here in Springfield. Ann Mora is also here from Springfield. Molly Murphy from Farmersville, although Molly had a college event with her freshman this year in college. Nina O'Connor, who's been with us last year and is continuing this year as she was ill toward the end of last year. And Charlene Volmer, did Charlene get here? Not yet, okay. So welcome to everyone. Oh, Margie, sorry. Throw something at me, Margie. Margie Greco, who is from Glenarm. And so it's wonderful to have you with us. Candidates, thank you for your response to the invitation to be a Dominican associate. I thank our sisters and associates who will be your sponsors and prayer sponsors this year, and they will be accompanying you throughout this formation process and share their experiences as Dominican sisters and Dominican associates. But all of our sisters, which is about 140 some now, will be holding you in prayer throughout this year. This morning, Sister Marilyn Jean was the leader of prayer, so she prayed for all of you as we begin this program. The Associate Formation Program provides opportunities for us to connect with each other, to build positive relationships, to gather as a community, to pray together, and to nourish our faith life. We will study the dimensions of church, Dominican life, and the Dominican charism, which is rooted in the 4 pillars of prayer, study, community, and ministry. We will look at the call that God gives to each one of us to preach his word by the way we live and to live the gospel message in our daily lives in the various places where we minister. Your emails, with your permission, will be added to a Google listing so that you can receive group messages from me, prayer requests, which come several times a week, and also communications about Zoom opportunities for your own spiritual growth. And when we begin to open up a little bit more, also visiting here in our chapel and our mother house. Please see me if that's a concern for you to be part of a Zoom group. And please contact me if you have any prayer petitions that you would like us to remember. You have a child who's going to have a baby, for example, or you have someone who's ill. Those are the kinds of things that we send out to our 463 associates and our 140 Dominican sisters. And they go on 2 different prayer lines, so you have lots of people supporting you. We're going to begin our meeting as we do each time with prayer. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our speaker before she comes to the podium to join with the prayer. Sister Marilyn Jean is from Springfield, Illinois. She graduated from Little Flower School and Sacred Heart Academy. Sister has been in the field of education her entire professional career. She has a BA in English from St. Joseph College in Rensselaer, Indiana, a master's in administration and supervision from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, an MS in management and organizational behavior from Benedictine University in Lisle, as well as a PhD in organizational development from Benedictine University. Marilyn Jean taught middle school in Aurora and Mendota for 11 years. She served as principal for 19 years in New Berlin and Springfield, Illinois, and in Duluth, Minnesota. Sister was a diocesan director for the Office of Education for the Springfield Diocese for 8 years, and for the first president of Sacred Heart Griffin High School, when the community established the president-principal model of leadership. Marilyn is presently a professor at Benedictine University in Lisle, Illinois, and has served in this capacity since 2005. Sister is a certified facilitator in the National Organization Development Network and is called upon to lead many Springfield community groups in organizational development. She presently serves as the community representative with the Faith Coalition here in Springfield. So we are grateful to have Sister Marilyn Jean as our presenter today, who will be speaking to us about our foundation, our root founders, St. Dominic and St. Catherine. We'd like, first of all, to turn to our prayer. So Sister's going to come forward, and we do have some readers that we've asked to come up to speak in the mic. Maybe the readers want to come up to the front and be here in the order that you're reading, so we'll be set. And those on Zoom should have copies of the prayer. What you see at the top is a hymn to St. Dominic that we sing every evening as we gather for our evening prayer. O light of the church, doctor of truth, rose of patience, ivory of chastity, freely have you dispensed the waters of wisdom, preacher of grace, unite us to the blessed. Together, O light of the church. Before he was born, Dominic's mother had a dream in which she gave birth to a black and white spotted dog carrying a torch in its mouth. We thank you, God, for the life of Dominic, whose preaching brought the light of Christ to those who lived in ignorance. Sustain the ministry of the Springfield Dominican Sisters and the Dominican Associates by allowing the same light to pass through as in every encounter.
Together, Doctor of the Truth. Dominic spoke the truth of Christ incarnate, and his preaching upheld the dignity of the human person as a gift of God. We ask you, God, help us to respond to the goodness of all creation and with due reverence to recognize those we serve as your children.
Together, rose of patience. Dominic showed remarkable patience with his brethren and with church authorities. Help us, God, to be patient, not only with those we serve, but with the many others with whom we collaborate for the sake of ministry.
Together,
ivory of chastity.
Dominic understood that chastity is a way of loving which spreads itself for good of others. Help us, God, to honor our family members, friends, co-workers, and others through words and deeds that speak of you.
Together, freely have you dispensed the waters of wisdom, Dominic freely shared his intellectual and spiritual gifts for the common good. Show us, God, how to use our gifts at prayer, at study, at meetings, and in every setting throughout the day.
Together,
Preacher of grace, unite us to us.
Dominic's preaching built up unity among the faithful and the entire communion of saints. Help us, God, be preachers of grace, to build up the bonds of community within the associates and the congregation.
Eternal,
Triune God, with gratitude for the life of Saint Dominic, light of the Church, we ask you to bless this session of associate candidate formation. Send the Holy Spirit to instruct us in wisdom, so that, like Saint Dominic, we may continue to bring the light of Christ to the world.
Sister Joan said that if the prayer people want to leave, you can, but you're very welcome to stay for the presentation. Before I go over to the table where I'm going to sit and to present this, I would like to acknowledge Sister Susan Karina Dickey, who did the research for the presentation that I'm going to give, and who also prepared the PowerPoint. Sister Susan Karina is a historian by trade and by profession, so her work in researching is excellent. She works in Jackson, Mississippi. She's the vice president for mission integration down there. And she wasn't able to come today, and so I was asked to present it, okay? And I'm going to go over here because I'm going to be looking at my notes while I'm doing it, okay? The other thing that I just noticed in this prayer, you will be hearing these phrases as we go through the presentation. So I think it was really good that we heard them as prayer first. Should I turn this off, Tom?
Yes.
Well, off. Okay. I think I'm going to hold the mic because then I don't have to be reaching over to get close to it. Today, we're going to look at the crossroads of time and place that introduced our founder of the Order of St. Dominic and the foremost woman of the order, Catherine of Siena.
Has to be on.
Is that turned on and are you pushing the right arrow? Sometimes it's,
Thank you so much. I was so conscious of the battery not running out when I practiced, I turned it off. Okay, there we go. All right, you and I, all of us, we're not contemporaries of the first disciples, those learned people who followed Jesus in ancient Palestine, nor do we live in medieval Europe where Catherine and Dominic were. But like those first disciples and Dominic and Catherine, God calls each of us to live the gospel in particular ways. It might be here in Springfield, it might be in Chicago, Jackson, Mississippi, another small town along the prairies of Illinois, or even Peru, South America. As we go along in this presentation, I invite you to contemplate the intersection of time and place in your life that maybe has brought you here today. And as we look at this slide, every picture that's on this slide is someone preaching the gospel, giving us the good news. So as we go along today, you can think, Is it my line? Here. What would we do without Aaron? Okay. 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 Here we have Catherine and Dominic. Dominic was born in 1171, as you can see on the slide. Catherine was born in 1347. And although Catherine was born almost 175 years after Dominic, both of them lived in the medieval Europe, the Middle Ages. And this was a time between the ancient world of the Roman Empire and the modern world of Europe and its city-states. However, there's a lot that you and I have in common with Catherine and Dominic. Human nature, our universal needs, the rites of passage that we've all gone through in our life. But our attitudes, our patterns, our understanding. This is interesting because Aaron and I practiced on Friday and everything went well. And the reason we practiced, and we said, that doesn't mean something won't go off on Sunday. So Jesus and Catherine and Dominic and the Holy Spirit, stay with us and keep this on, okay? Okay, we are certainly different in our patterns of thinking and our understanding of ourselves. And our society is very different from what was there for Dominic and Catherine. But let's go back now and peel off the layers of time, going back to Dominic and Catherine's time before anybody walked on the moon, before we ever had antibiotics or Freud or the Reformation. Actually, in Dominic's time, buttons were an innovation. So we could see that the technology we have certainly wasn't part of his life. Even Arabic numerals were replacing Roman numerals at that time. Notre Dame Cathedral was being built and wasn't even finished until about 30 years after Dominic's death. St. Peter's Basilica wasn't even there as we know it now. And even the printing press had not been invented. This is supposed to be a little bit humorous. Notice the printing press there is the monk sitting at the lectern, okay? And for heaven's sake, the copier broke down again. Sort of like our technology today, okay? All right. How do we even know anything about these two people? Well, we can go to primary sources like biographies that are written by people who knew about them or that were written by the person themselves. For instance, we have Catherine's letters and prayers and her dialogue with God, which is known as the Dialogue of St. Catherine, which we'll talk about later. Most of us have to rely on translations from the original works, but they are in English. And you have a little biography in your folder today if you're interested in reading more about either Dominic or Catherine. You can look them up. One of Catherine's, I think he was her spiritual director, her advisor, Raymond of Capua, wrote a very good edition of Catherine and about her life. And it's not all historical. Some of it's what we call hagiography and biography. Biography is the real facts. Hagiography sometimes tells stories, and some of it's facts, and some of it's rather embellished. But the idea was to give the spiritual edification to the reader or to the listener. And some of these things you'll hear, and today you'll say, that has to be hagiography. Okay. Actually, it does tell you the truth about the person. It tells you their spirit. And we'll be using both biography and hagiography today. So let's set the scene for Catherine and Dominic. This map actually depicts feudal Europe, about midway between the life of these two saints. Now, if you look over on the far left, where Spain is today, you'll see a little cross over Castile. That's where Dominic came from. He was born in a town called Calaruega. If you go over what is today Italy, you'll see another little cross, and that's where Catherine was born, in Siena. Dominic was called a Castilian, and Catherine was from Tuscany. Now we might ask ourselves, what was feudal Europe really like? Well, it was sort of like this slide. Society was very highly stratified, no social mobility. If you were a peasant, you stayed a peasant down at the end. If you were a knight, a noble, etc., you stayed there. But you also helped one another. You see how the arrows are there, that they were connected in some way. But the peasants never left the land. They were tied to the place. There was no moving upward. But in Dominic's day, cities were beginning to grow. Cities like Paris, London, Florence, Rome, and a merchant class was emerging. By Catherine's time, Italy had moved into what we called independent city-states. Catherine lived in one of these city-states, which was Siena, and her father was a dyer of wool and a businessman. Dominic's family were not peasants. His father was actually a local magistrate, a judge and an administrator in Calaruega in the kingdom of Castile. Notice I said kingdom, and he was the lord, okay? This is Calaruega today. And I just will slip in here that I was very privileged in the early 2000s to be on what we call the lands of Dominic. So I actually saw this city and was able to tour some of the places that you see there. The large tower in the middle of the picture is the only structure that survives from Dominic's day. Calaruega in Dominic's day was like a frontier city. It was between the Christians and the Muslims. And that's why that tower was there, because it was sort of like a defense mechanism where people watched to see if anything would be happening or if anything would be coming that would be dangerous. The name Calaruega actually means chalk oven, and it's not unlike our southwestern states with mesas. In Calaruega, when Dominic was there, herding was the mainstay. Dominic actually belonged to the second generation of Castilians who lived in the region, and it was formerly belonged to the Moors, who were Muslims from Morocco. So there was that, you know, not so much we like each other type of thing. And in the tower on the slide, that's the tower you saw on the other one, and that predates Dominic. It was a part of this defensive frontier. His father, who was named Felix de Guzman is Dominic's last name, depended on the cooperation of the other men in the village. And these men also had a voice in the appointment of him as Lord to serve as observers in this tower. Now notice, had a voice in his appointment. That's going to impact Dominic later. Dominic grew up in a time when ordinary men actually did have some influence on the local governing structure and the lord of their area. And we wonder if this influenced Dominic when he set up the governance of the Dominican community. Because even today, and from the very beginning, Dominicans elect the superior, the person who is in charge of everyone and everything, for a term of office, not for life. And as we know, other religious communities, and back in those days, they elected their leaders for life, like abbesses and abbots in the Benedictine tradition. Once the leader of a Dominican community has completed his or her term, they go back to the ranks. And that happens here. About every 5 years, we do that. Their term is up, they just go back, they're back one of us. And this was kind of an innovation in that time. And it may be part of why, because Dominic experienced that in his childhood, that he set up Dominican governance the way it is today. The picture at the right over here is Dominic's mother. Now, again, this might be hagiography, but anyway, it's been told forever. One of the pious legends about Jane, who was his mother, is that she had a dream in which she gave birth to a black and white spotted dog carrying a torch in his mouth. You see the spotted torch there and the little dog? This was said to be a foreshadowing of Dominic as light of the church. That was one of his titles, signifying that he carried the gospel, the light of the gospel, to the world. This picture is of a stained glass window somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where it is, but it is in here to tell us about a legend that dates to his grandmother. His grandmother had a dream, and in that dream, she said that a star appeared on Dominic's head at his baptism, surely a sign that this was going to be God's favor to him. And actually, even to this day, Dominic is the saint of astronomers. When Dominic was about 7, his parents sent him off to school. 7, sent him off to school, okay? Not down the street, okay? This was typical of the boys of social standing in that day. They would be educated under the care of a trusted friend or relative. In Dominic's case, it was his uncle, who was actually a priest in Palencia. Dominic received a classical education, which included grammar, logic, mathematics, rhetoric, music, astronomy, and Latin, which was the language of the day of the educated. We really don't know Dominic's vocation story, like some of us can tell our vocation story, how we came to be what we are. It wasn't unusual in a family of that day that they at least nudged and encouraged one of their sons to be a priest. Family connections were everything in the society. Remember, it's the feudal days. And since the church was one of the most powerful institutions of the day, it was very important to have relatives who were priests or religious. After Dominic's studies, he was ordained around 1190, which means he was only about 20 years old when he was ordained a priest. Early on in his priesthood, Dominic came to the cathedral at Osma. And on the left-hand side, we see the cathedral of Osma. Now that wall that's around there actually dates back to the time of Dominic, but the tower in the background was built much later. The cathedrals in those days had several priests, and they were known as canons, and they educated other men for the priesthood and kind of took care of the affairs of the diocese. Note the priest on this side, the right-hand side, he's one of the canons, and that might have been what Dominic looked like when he was standing in the residence of the cathedral where he was stationed. This is an important fact too. Public preaching was reserved only to bishops in that day. People had to come from wherever they are to the cathedral to hear a preaching or a homily, as we call it today. Ordinary priests did not do public speaking. Remember that as we learn how Dominic formed an order of preachers. In the slide over here on the left, well, it's the right. I always get my left and right mixed up, but anyway, it's the one down here at the bottom. That pictures his bishop, Diego, who was at the cathedral where he was. It's just a stained glass that shows the two of them. Dominic, when he was a very young priest, was selected by Diego to accompany him on a journey to Denmark. And that was about 1,000 miles away as the crow flies. They were sent there by the king. Now, kind of unusual that a king would send a priest and a bishop on an excursion, but that was very common in those days because the church was very important, very in the society. When they went, they had an entourage, like you see at the top of the slide. So Diego, the bishop, and Dominic and probably the archdeacon who accompanied them would ride on the horses. They needed interpreters because they were going to a foreign land. They needed guides. They needed men to care for the animals. It was very reasonable for Diego to travel by horseback. However, later on, he rejected this form of transportation because it was associated in the minds of the poor with high living, and neither Diego or Dominic wanted to have that reputation. This is the era of the church and the state when they are very, very entwined by ties of mutual interest and sometimes even blood. Ties of personal loyalty is what held this feudal society together. Now we say a little bit about Catherine. You notice the arrow going in toward Italy, and then maybe you can see the word Siena. It's in Tuscany, about the middle of Tuscany. That's where Catherine grew up. The state of Italy did not emerge until about the 19th century. But Catherine lived in what we call Tuscany, and it was one of the city-states. Like Dominic, Catherine was born in the Middle Ages. However, the roles of women in the Middle Ages were very, very limited. One significant difference between Dominic and Catherine is that one was a man and one was a woman. And gender roles in that time were very, very rigid, nothing like they are here in our day. But you will see as we learn about Catherine that she had her own ideas about what was appropriate behavior for a woman. And sometimes they came into great conflict with people of her age. She was a forerunner. This is again a picture of what Siena looks like today, the plaza there. This picture was taken around 2005. But in the background, you can see a big church, and that church is the Church of San Domenico, which was Catherine's parish church, and it's still there today. Catherine's father was a dyer of wool, and their family name was Benincasa. Their workshop and their home were all in the same area. You can see the wool being made over there, the dyeing. You can see where they lived and where some of their family lived there too, because the workshop actually employed family and others. So it was kind of a compound, you might say, of people. Catherine's mother, Lapa, bore 26 children. Some of them were twins. Can you imagine? 26, okay. In fact, Catherine herself was a twin, but her twin died at birth. Catherine was the very youngest in this family. Can you imagine what it was like in that household? 26 children, plus the people that worked for her father, plus everything else that was going on. And the other thing is that Siena was not a peaceful place. A lot of times there was violence and feuding and fighting. The other thing that Catherine was famous for is that was very difficult, is she lived through the bubonic plague. Okay, this is Benincasa as it appears today. It's a shrine of St. Catherine. And again, that was one of the spots, if you went on the Lanza Dominic tour, you actually saw. The statue that's seen over here, kind of in the middle, has been copied many, many times by artists and sculptors. Very famous picture. In fact, we have a version of this statue as a drawing in one of our halls over in St. Catherine Hall. It was created by our own sister, Regina Marie, one of our very talented artists, who very recently has gone to be with God. From early childhood, Catherine was a very pious child. You see this small insert here. Legend has said that as a small child, once when she was walking home with her brothers and sisters, she fell into a trance and had this vision, which is, God and some of his cohorts up in the top. Want to change?
Yeah, let's see if that helps. This one has a fresh battery.
Oh, okay. What would we do without Beth? Okay. Okay. Catherine did have a lot of chores as a child. In fact, sometimes her parents sent her to this very public fountain, which is still there today, and was down the hill from her home. In her writings, if you read any of her writings, you'll see that she often uses the image of a cup that is constantly flowing over with God's love and grace. Maybe she had seen an image like that many, many times as she stuck her bucket to get water here and bring it back home. Okay, so far, we've kind of looked at some of the times and places that shaped Dominic and Catherine. So I'd like to give you just a little bit of time to reflect in your life. Well, who are the people, the places, the history that shaped you? Was there a mentor or some other person who influenced you and nourished your spirituality or shaped the direction of your life? Would you just think about that for a few minutes? And if you'd like to share with the person you're sitting with, do that. I'll give you about 5 minutes, okay?
My parents were the first members. School.
Yeah. More online. Because Linda and Carol Huss weren't supposed to be there, so I sent him, a connection, and you would have that too. So I was happy to see them. Carol lost her husband 2 years ago. A while with other things, and she's had a real hard time. But she's has been very involved with the grants.
back over to a group, you cross your fingers and say, I sure hope they'll be interested and want to do this. And if I stopped you too soon, we'll have another time to talk just a little bit later. But I'm sure it's brought you to a realization that you've had places and people in your life that have brought you to where you are today. You've had mentors. Okay, so Dominic and Catherine both had those. We have those. And something has brought you to want to be an associate. So, you might want to think about that too. Who was your mentor? What happened? What made it come about? Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to go back to Dominic. We were talking about Catherine a little bit. You remember that trip that I told you about when we had the slide with the long entourage of people and they were going to Denmark, I believe? Okay, well, that journey to Denmark, which was way north of where they were, Dominic and Ozma, where Dominic and Diego were, was really life-changing for Dominic. It was his very first encounter with the Cathars. The Cathars were very unusual people. They were dualists. They believed in a God of good and a God of evil. Everything material was evil, including the human body. They were a sect and they were known as the Albigensians. We've heard of the Albigensian heresy, and it's called that because they lived in a little town or city called Albi. They were very numerous and influential in the southern part of France. And if you go, Spain, where the purple dot is, okay, that's where Dominic and Diego were, and then they moved up where you see the kind of orange dot and you see Toulouse, okay? They were very numerous in that area, in a little area that was called Languedoc. Interesting, huh? Languedoc. It's a French word, but they tell me that's how you pronounce it, okay? In the city of Toulouse, Diego and Dominic stayed in an inn that was actually run by a Cathar. Now, that would be a very scary thing to do, a bishop and a priest staying in an inn run by a Cathar, because the Cathars did not like Catholics, okay? So, but Dominic, sitting over here on this side, spent the whole night talking to the Cathar, and they were just discussing their different beliefs. They certainly didn't believe the same way, but believe it or not, by morning, the Cathar had reconciled to the church and wanted to become Catholic rather than Cathar. Now, undoubtedly, Dominic had preached before that night, but this is the first really public record of his preaching. Some pictures will show this innkeeper at Dominic's feet, kneeling at his feet, and maybe he did. But what we want to learn from this particular incident are two things about Dominic. He was very concerned about the eternal soul of each individual, even each individual Cathar. And he was very willing to engage in conversation, especially willing to engage in ideas and arguments of the other person, to debate, to look for the truth. The innkeeper, who was a Cathar, was considered to be a heretic. Now, we've heard of heretics. We don't use that word very much today, but a heresy was very dangerous in the time of Dominic, because it infected the immortal life, the eternal life of the individual. And it was also a threat to the people in the area because they would influence each other. It was something that spread like an infection, and it was so dreaded that it was a rationale for execution in the days of Dominic. In the medieval mind, heretics and the faithful just could not coexist. Religious pluralism as we know it today was definitely not on the mental landscape. But here's Dominic spending a night with one of these heretics. Heretics didn't want to associate with Catholics, and Catholics didn't want to associate with the Cathars. The Cathars were sort of like in little enclaves, little cults, you might say, in our today. But they were very, very numerous in southern France. Sometimes even within a family, there were Cathars and Catholics in the same family. This tells us a little bit more about the Cathars. Two gods, as I said, good and evil. Human beings were thought to be spirits trapped in evil bodies. There was reincarnation. You know, today we even hear people speak of believing in reincarnation. But eventually, in the Cathars' mind, the eventual release of the spirit came from the body by a reincarnation of some type. They thought Jesus was an angel in the form of a human body. They didn't believe in the resurrection. There was only one sacrament, and that they received toward the end of their life to remove their sins, which would enable them to be perfect and enter heaven. Some other characteristics that you'll hear about later in this talk, they lived very simply. They didn't believe Jesus was God, but they did see him as their model. They absolutely rejected the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church. Now we know there's been times through the history of the church when we've had people that said, Roman Catholic Church, you're kind of off the guard here. You know, remember the time of Martin Luther? Okay. Now that was terrible at that time, but in retrospect, we know that some of the things Martin was complaining about really were true. Okay. Even in our own day, we have these sides about what's right in the Catholic Church and what's not. Okay, these people rejected baptism and all the other sacraments. They abstained from meat and they refused to take oaths. Late in about 1206, Diego and Dominic began to spend some time in Fanjo in nearby Peru, two important towns in the history of the Dominican order. There were still Cathars around there, but they weren't down in this area of Toulouse. This is Peru. This is a real picture, again, that you would see if you went on the lands of Dominic. And it's Peru seen from Fanjo. We'll see a picture of Fanjo in a minute. They operated in a little rundown church in Peru. It was their headquarters. They would pray there and they would go out to the different cities for debates. They called them disputations. In that area, there was a small group of Cathar women. Now, they wouldn't have been invited to the debates and disputations because remember, I told you, women had a very rigid life at that time. They weren't allowed out and around. But some of these women must have heard what Dominic was preaching and they converted to Catholicism. And actually, this is how the Dominican nuns were established. Now, there's a little secret here that I always tell people. There's a difference between nuns and sisters, okay? We're sisters. We do have some Dominican nuns living over in Siena temporarily, but it was the nuns that Dominic brought into existence at this time of his life. Dominic and Diego were very worried about this small group of women because certainly their families had cut them off. What was going to happen to them? Well, one night, Dominic looked over at Peru, which was, you know, quite a ways. If you look over to the left-hand side of the slide, he saw a ball of fire in the sky. And it hovered over this little rundown church, which they had used as their headquarters in Peru. And he said, this is where this group of women need to be. And so a religious community was established for these women. They became the first cloistered Dominican nuns. In fact, these Dominican nuns were founded before the friars or the men were officially founded in the Dominican order. Their life was one of prayer and penance, and they were a support for the preaching mission. Now, the people that were with Dominic were not necessarily Dominicans because the Dominican order didn't even exist then, but they went out together, groups, sort of like Jesus and his disciples, you know, and preached around the area. And so the nuns were to be a prayer support. And sometimes when the groups would come back, the nuns would probably fix a meal for them, you know, and give them something nice to have and so on. They were a support. Peru Pruy actually became a model for the relationship between the friars and the nuns of the order, that they would always be there to support one another. In fact, today, the nuns of the order are much more connected to the friars than, say, the sisters are. It's not that we're not connected to them by knowing them and operating with them, but the nuns really, the friars have some authority over the nuns. Okay, and this is Fanjo, a view up the hill to Puri from Fanjo, so that's where Dominic was going to let these people be. Dominic and Diego noticed that the Cathars and their clergy lived very simple lives. You can kind of see that by the picture. Dominic and Diego were still traveling by horseback with their big entourage wherever they went anywhere. However, as they interacted with the Cathars, they decided, no, we aren't going to use these horses and these entourages. We're going to go on feet, by foot. And of course, this enhanced their credibility to the Cathars. They were becoming more simple. Here you see two pictures of the debates between Dominic and his companions with the Cathars. In the time of Dominic, debates were not like what we see now on TV with political candidates, etc. They were just structured ways of testing the truth, of looking at ideas one against another to see what was really the real truth. It was a way of seeking veritas, which means truth, which is the motto of the Dominican order, became the motto back then and still is. Dominic believed that our preaching of the gospel implied a respectful and rigorous engagement with the opinions of those with whom we disagree. You don't have to agree with everybody to have a conversation with them. But when you talk together about ideas, sometimes you can come to a middle ground. You learn from your opponents. The picture over here on the right is said to be a debate that was in the city of Montreal. The Cathars and Dominic and his people were arguing back and forth, trying to test who was truth, and they decided they were going to pitch their books into the fire. The Cathars' book burned up immediately, but Dominic's book, probably the Bible, leapt from the fire unmired, and if you can see it up in the air in this picture on the right, okay. Now maybe that's legend, maybe it's part of the hagiography, but what it was really saying that there is truth, and Dominic and his followers were trying to make sure what they were sharing was truth. The image on the other side is another picture of Dominic having this debate with the Cathars. Notice the faces on these people. Some of them are saying, oh, come on now. And some of them are saying, well, maybe. And some of them are just turning their back and walking away. But that's kind of the way Dominic operated in his early years. The picture over here on the left shows Dominic preaching and the bishop, Diego, sitting down in the far bottom corner. Notice that role of Diego. In a sense, it was like the mentor and the protege. Dominic is preaching, Diego is supporting. After their time in this area that we're talking about right now, Dominic and Diego decided to go back to Osma. Remember, that was where the cathedral was. You know, like you go on a sabbatical, get away from what you're doing, kind of clear your head or whatever. So they went back for a little while, but it wasn't long before they sought out again to go to the Cathars because they knew that these people needed them. So they went back to what we call Languedoc. And working there at that time were some Cistercians, which was a religious group. And they had actually been authorized to preach to the Cathars. Now that was unusual because only the bishops were supposed to preach at that time. However, they had not had very much success. and some other Cathars had come to join them in the mission, and they were just very discouraged. And most of these people, the Cistercians, were either bishops or masters of theology, so they were intelligent. They knew what they were talking about. But they said, no, this is too much for us. We can't do it. However, Dominic and Diego remained. They had a mission to work with the Cathars. In August of 1207, Diego himself returned to Osma. And unfortunately, in that year, he died. But the new bishop supported Dominic and allowed him to remain in Languedoc. They had to have the permission to be there. They just couldn't go off on their own into it. However, this time in Dominic's life was very sad. He suffered the loss of his mentor and friend. It's said that these were some of his darkest days. And I think we can relate to that. We've all lost a mentor, a friend who was very important to our development. Well, here was Dominic. All these years they've been working on this. Now he's left there alone. One of Dominic's companions, a Cistercian, was actually in this time assassinated by a count that was in that area. And as a result, Pope Innocent III initiated the crusade against the Cathars. A lot of times we get accused of being involved in the crusades. It was brutal, and that crusade continued until after Dominic's death. This cross is sometimes called an assassin's cross because it's a point in the area between Fanjeaux and Bruy where Dominic was almost assassinated. Someone attempted to kill him. And that's probably a picture of one of the Lands of Dominic tours in today's age. But that cross is very important in the history of Dominic. Now, a crusade was going on. It was called because of that assassination of one of his companions. What did Dominic think of the crusades? We actually have no direct evidence of what he thought. However, he was closely associated with one of the counts and one of the crusaders. And that person actually provided Dominic land. He provided exemption from taxes for him and gave a lot of assistance to Dominic in his work. However, the stories that come from the brethren that were with Dominic say that Dominic was never bloodthirsty. He never rejoiced in the execution of a heretic. And that's what the Crusades would have been about. One Dominican historian says that Dominic never directly cooperated with the Crusades. Did he think the Crusades were justified? We don't know. All we know is that he knew one of the Crusaders and he accepted gifts from them. In 1215, Dominic becomes connected with another bishop, Bishop Falk of Toulouse. Remember when we had the map up there, there was Spain down here and France up here, and Toulouse was up there in that part of France. Well, this bishop welcomed Dominic and his companions. Wherever Dominic was, he seemed to have some people with him that traveled with him. And this bishop offered a permanent home for Dominic and his companions. And that home was their home for over 100 years. And you actually see kind of a wall of it over there in the far left-hand side of the picture. This was where the holy preaching first began to assume kind of a structure in which they were going to live together and work together. However, Bishop Falk had a mandate for Dominic and his followers. He said, as preachers, you are to root out heresy and to drive out vice. You're to teach the creed and promote sound morals. Now, notice, at that time, they were preaching to the heretics, rooting out heresy and rooting out vice, but they were instructing the faithful, teaching and encouraging sound morals. This is part of the genius of the Dominican order. It's called theological reflection and adult faith formation. We still do that today. Bishop Falk was very interested in this group of Dominicans. And so he entrusted them to a mission for life in his diocese. They could work and preach and do in his diocese. They were, however, to be mendicants, that is, begging for everything. One historian says that the Dominicans were called mobile monks. You know, monks were like the Benedictines and Cistercians and so on. But their work was different from those kinds of monks because their work involved mental work, study, teaching, preaching. In the fall of 1215, Dominic and Bishop Falk went to Rome for the Lateran Council. Dominic was about 43 years old now. This is a time when the Dominican order, actually the Dominican order, began to take place. He and Bishop Falk thought it was about time to formalize a structure for the holy preaching. So in October of that year, Dominic was able to meet Innocent III, who was the Pope at that time. One account of what happened at the Council of Lateran is the following, and I quote, "There were two canons of special significance for the Dominicans." Now the canons would be like laws, you know, we talk about canon law in the church. So there were two canons that were promoted at that time. The first one was Canon 13, and it said that Dominic could establish a group, but no religious orders could, at that time, could have new rules. So he would have to use the rule of St. Augustine as the foundation of his Dominican life. And just as an aside, when Francis went to do his order, the Pope let them write his own rule, but Dominic had to take one that somebody else was using. Okay, but the better and more important rule or canon or promulgation was number 10. And it called for all bishops to appoint preachers to support those bishops in their ministry of the word. Now remember, only bishops could preach at that time, but this canon was saying others can preach. Where bishops might be ill, overworked, facing hostility, maybe even not so smart, they were to find suitable men that were powerful in work and word to exercise the fruitful result of the office of preaching. Men who diligently visiting the people, committed to them, instructed them by word and example. If that seems kind of formal, I'm reading it directly from the canon that came out. Okay, these men, they were Dominic and his followers, and they were going to be assistants to the bishops, coadjutors, not only in the preaching, but they could help in the confessional, they could help in other matters that actually pertain to the good of souls. Now, that didn't really establish the order yet. So a year later, when the Dominican order was established by Pope Honorius III, its constitutions emphasized the fact that it was known from the beginning to have been instituted especially for the salvation of souls. Early in the time, the great days of the Mendicant Friars were just beginning, but now with the Vatican, with Lateran Council IV, there was a timeless call for new workers in the Lord's vineyard. It set the tone for the first generation of preachers. And even now, centuries later, the call to continue the apostolic preaching is what we do as Dominicans. These two confirmed laws or canons were issued in December of 1215. And at that council, Pope Honorius III, who was succeeded Innocent, made those official. But Dominic wasn't through yet. He didn't think it was exactly correct. So in 2016, he went back to Rome to complete the work that he wanted to establish his foundation. He arrived in September, but he didn't receive the actual approval of his order until December of that year. In that proclamation, Honorius said, and I quote, "We, considering that the brethren of the order will be the champions of the faith and true lights of the world, do confirm this order in all its lands and possessions, present and to come. And we take them under our protection, and we also take over the government of the order itself with all its goods and rights. Now, that might have sounded good, but it was a little ambiguous for Dominic. So he continued to consult with the Pope. And in January of the next year, 1217, he officially was able to get the order of the preachers to be established. You know what? I was supposed to do that slide just before the other one. That's Pope Honorius over there, and that's Rome, where they went for the Lateran Council. For many, many years, there are stories about Dominic sending the brethren out to preach, and this slide kind of shows that, sending them out. Even though many of them were not really well educated or having masters in theology, but he sends even novices out to preach. Dominic is remembered by echoing Jesus. Do not worry about what you are to preach. God will put power in your mouth. So in August of 2017, Dominic dispersed the brethren. These were the earliest days, and when he dispersed them, he made sure that they were going to be educated. It's said that the brethren usually went 2 by 2 to various universities and colleges. From the onset, they were to be a clerical institute. They were to preach. They were to recite the divine office. They also could have lay brothers, who today are called corporate brothers, and they provided domestic service. However, later on, the Dominicans did not have that kind of division in there. The lay brothers also could be teachers, professors, and work in other capacities. Note the phrase down at the bottom of this slide. Formed through prayer, sacrament, study, and community, Dominic sends forth the brethren. That's the origin of our charism. As you're going through your formation times in the associate program, you will hear about our charism, which is prayer, study, community, and preaching, which is the mission. One measure of the founder of an order is to provide for its continuation beyond his death. And Dominic did that. By 2021, when he was ready for death, and we see some of his companions around him the day when he is dying, he had established a group of very capable leaders who could carry on the order as it was set up. Dominic died in Bologna. And some years later, even though he was buried in Bologna, some years later in the church, it was necessary that the remains be removed from the church and, oops, pardon me here. Oh, we missed something. Sorry, there's something missing there. Okay, that's all right. They asked Michelangelo to do a tomb for Dominic, and I had a picture of that tomb that I changed, but I had given this what do you call it, the slides to Aaron ahead of time, so that slide isn't in here. But what's really important for us to see on this slide is Dominic's last will and testament to his brethren and to all of us. And you'll see this on holy cards, you'll see it on framed pictures, etc. Dominic said, "Have charity for one another. Guard humility. Make your treasure out of voluntary poverty." And at this point, I'll let you have a break, okay? I think we have some little refreshments over there that Sister Martha Maria's gotten ready for us. Okay.
Sister Neil is coming to me.
Mr. Mila.
I was in the middle of the meeting when the meeting started, so I was not introduction, the official.
Yeah, I understand. I'm sure you know this stuff.
Yes, but there is always something.
Yeah.
We met once, 2.5 years ago. We were traveling to Peru and you were so nice to meet with me. Tell me what good food to eat and things like that.
Okay.
We went to Cusco.
Okay.
Hiked for about a week.
Okay.
That was a long time ago. I wouldn't expect you to remember me. But I told Lucinda about you.
Okay, well, nice to see you again here. We never know where we are going to go.
Yeah.
Oh, I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, it was wonderful.
Oh, sorry. The altitude.
Oh,
It is hard for me to, after living away from the Andes for so many years, I have to take oxygen when I go back.
We're living at sea level here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even in Lima, because Lima is zero. The level is zero.
Yes.
And then straight up at 4,000.
Yeah.
Hey, Martha, you were there. You drove on the mountain.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Oh, you're brave.
Yes,
Driving.
to driving.
I didn't know I was gonna drive when we got there, but our driver couldn't ride it. So it was either we drive or we stay there. So,
Wow. Very.
Yeah, why? And we are here to tell the story.
yes, we are. Thank you.
Good adventure.
Tale.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Because I am originally from the city, but then I went to a major ministry and mission in the world here. So I learned how to change tires, right, and all the that's when I understood that donkeys actually are intelligent. Shit, they go wild. They know how to do it.
Yeah. Well, those donkeys, they were on some of the trail, the Aiken Trail areas and stuff. Just so dirty. The snacks are ready for you tomorrow. Yes, very good.
I would go back.
Yeah.
Neighbors.
Yes. Yeah, we had snow.
Hiked every day. 5 days. I ended up in Machu Picchu, of course, because that was where everyone goes, I guess. I enjoyed the hike better than Machu Picchu because it was so crowded. There were so many people.
Yeah, with so many people around.
Yeah.
And yeah, monkey and
Oh, yeah.
That was gorgeous.
Smaller.
well, okay. Thank you. And if I'm not here.
The water.
We get a little water.
Keith, how are you?
I'm doing well.
You know, I talk about you.
Oh, yes.
We go way back, and thank you again. You know, those were good days when we had you, Captain Trainer there, and Jesus.
It's been a while.
Oh, my goodness, you know, that
It's nice connection. We talk about.
I didn't know there was a connection.
Well, Aaron.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Losing my identity.
Oh, don't say I just don't know. Yes. You're good. Oh, I know. Yeah, I took it off and I put on. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there might be something wrong in the system,
In the
like
system.
that it requires.
It's funny, I
change.
missed the hospital.
Yesterday, the fighter when I practiced, I said to him, you know, everything was just fine. I said, but you know, you never know, because you work it all out, you never know what's gonna happen on the day. And when that happened, I almost got kicked. Not really.
More.
Not really. I was saying,
Well,
"Oh,
it's
it's
not
Yeah.
constant.
Oh, absolutely. And you guys jumped right in there and took care of it. Well, we haven't fixed it yet, but.
Yes, that's right. She started the dermatology program. Yeah, she founded that. So, I've only been here 30 years, but it feels like home. In a good way. Oh, it's funny you say he turns 30 on Friday. So there you go. No, we're not any older, right? There you
All over the place.
We have 2 daughters, they're young, so they're all out. Go get something. It's a small world.
Have you eaten at Boyd's ever? Join us. Oh, Boyd's generation. South Grand, right across the street.
Oh, I think only. No, Marilyn. Okay, because when Kayla was here, when she started. There's one right there. That's the swimming pool locker room.
Oh, fun.
I knew nothing. I'm good.
I was sitting.
You're welcome.
I don't know if it's really I
Oh, well.
But I will go and talk. I don't have to. I saw you walking as well. I'm trying to be patient, but yesterday, the hospital. And then I have to go sometimes in the second, because I feel they were certain. And I said, well, maybe then I can walk a little bit home. 1:15, we'll go there. There are sometimes.
Yeah, right.
I sat with them. We don't pay to buy nothing.
Yeah.
They all.
Yeah. Well, I don't party.
No,
Rosemary and Dawn and Rebecca had a recording and then you're there.
No, I work at the clinic.
Yeah.
Today's the first time.
At least, yeah.
Her daughter is a freshman. And so she had.
That's a special.
Not the same thing. She did.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. That's what she So their sponsor is Marilyn. So they didn't have sponsors to sit with them, and I didn't have to be in the so we.
That worked out pretty well.
So we got together. Yes.
And I am in the process now. I
feel comfortable, you know.
Oh, thank God, I'm teaching. And before I entered the service. But because of the COVID, some of the courses are online, so I can't do them here. And,
So where are you teaching? Okay.
I'm teaching scriptures.
Well, and she's taught a class for years. Fortunate to take. Those were wonderful.
Yes, it's different. Yes, I really like the contact when we can have the groups and then the great conversation. Sometimes for teams, it's not possible. You have 30 people and everybody's telling her hand. Hand number one.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's different. We do what we get. And I told them, yeah, you can send my your questions. You have lots of questions. First thing, the next one.
So has the class started already?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And this is for Chicago. We are choosing Chicago.
Our son went to Loyola. Turned 30 on Friday, so it was a while back. He stayed up.
I like it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Would you mind kind of coming back to your places, please?
All right.
See what
Thanks, man. So if I, you know, randomly pick up
I hope not.
I don't think there's other folks that want to do it.
This part of the presentation is all about Catherine of Siena. It's not quite as long as the first part. But since you had a little break, you got a little refreshment and able to walk around a little bit. Okay. Like Dominic, Catherine was born in the Middle Ages. And certainly the time she lived in shaped her life, just like our lives have been shaped by the time we lived in. As I said before, the only difference between Catherine and Dominic is that Dominic a man and she's a woman. And the gender roles back in that time were much different than they are today. However, as we go on with this bit about Catherine, we'll see that she really had her own ideas about what was appropriate for a woman at the time, and sometimes came into conflict with what others thought women should do. But she did great things despite that. At the age of 7, Catherine experienced a vision of Jesus and made a private vow of virginity, 7 years old. Now, a girl of her social standing would be expected to marry when she was in her mid-teens. And marriages were arranged so that they would be advantageous to both families. Her parents were already setting things up, and Catherine knew it. As you see in this one picture of her, she decided to cut her hair to show that she had no intention of marrying, because I guess that long, beautiful hair was part of the attraction, you know, of the whole business. Catherine really wanted to join a group called the Mantellate. They were a group of pious widows. They were like lay Dominicans of today. But her parents were very much against that. So as punishment for cutting her hair, her parents made her wait at table at home. Remember, they had 26 children and lots of other people around. And she had to perform tasks that were ordinarily done by servants. But Catherine just took it in the way that she was serving Christ. Eventually, her father allowed her to join the group of women widows. This is the interior of the Church of San Domenico. We saw that back in one of the other slides, I believe, up on the hill. We didn't see the inside of it. This was her parish church. And again, this is really the way it looks today. Over in the side here, you can see the outside of it. That was another place in the lands of Dominic that we would visit. You can see those are contemporary people in there. These lay women that she joined would sit in the back of the church on a special platform. And their ministry was to visit the sick, to perform other works of charity. And this was considered very acceptable for them because they were widows of means. In other words, they had money, they could give it to charity, and that's really what they wanted to do with their life. Well, reluctantly in the beginning, these ladies did not think Catherine should be part of them. They wouldn't even accept her. How could a girl who could be married be serious about joining a group of widows? But eventually, they let her come aboard. However, Catherine wasn't going to do the same kind of work. She had her own idea. Remember, we said she's a woman who decides her own path here. Rather than engage in these active works of charity, she decided to spend about 3 years in seclusion within a place in their home at Benicasa. And if anybody who ever visits that, you see this little room that she had, that it was sort of like her cloister, very, very small room. They had to bring her food and all that kind of thing. Sometimes people came to the window to talk to her there. However, this time, these 3 years in this little seclusion ended in what we call a mystical espousal. In the Catholic tradition, mystical espousal is an experience given to some. Christ takes the mystic as his bride. And in her vision, it is the Christ child who comes to her, to Catherine, and gives her a ring, invisible to anybody else at her request, but that they are connected. And from our 21st century perspective, it may seem like over the top, okay? But everything about Catherine is a little over the top to her contemporaries and to us. She was different. She was unique. She was about her way. But whatever you think of these stories of the espousal and the ring and all those kinds of things, whatever we think of those, what we really do know, and that's what those stories are supposed to help us understand, that Catherine was very, very, very close to Jesus. She lived mostly on water and raw vegetables. Today, she'd probably be diagnosed as anorexic. To Catherine, her main food was the Blessed Sacrament that sustained her. In her day, no one received communion, not even every Sunday, let alone every day. But one of the legends, again, about Catherine is that at Mass, the consecrated host would fly through the air and come to Catherine across the church so that she could receive the body of Christ daily. In 1370, Catherine received a series of visions of hell, purgatory, and heaven, after which she heard a command to leave her withdrawal and to go into public life. Again, very, very different for a woman of her time. Catherine also received what we call the stigmata, and that's what the second picture is supposed to portray. The stigmata, is the wounds of Christ in the hands and feet. But and I think the last person in our time to have that was Padre Pio, if anybody remembers that name. But Catherine, her choice was that these marks not be visible to anybody, so that, it was her connection with Christ, not something that other people would see. In later years, Catherine actually traveled to Avignon to urge Pope Gregory to return to Rome. Now, some of you may know this story, that for 67 years, the popes had lived in Avignon because there was some kind of disagreement of the popes and the non-popes in Rome. And so the real popes took off and stayed in Avignon. Well, Catherine said, no, you need to come back. Well, first Gregory said yes, then he said no, back and forth. But eventually he did return to Rome. Here are a few of the scenes. Again, some of them might be legends, but they tell us a little bit about what Catherine was like. The upper left is a picture that says Catherine being tormented by demons. In the upper right, it shows an exchange of hearts of Catherine and Jesus, again depicting how very close she was to Jesus. In the lower right, we have a picture of her receiving communion. And then the last picture on the left is a story of Catherine finding a beggar and giving him a coat to wear. And then a few hours later, Jesus reveals to her that he was the beggar. There was more to her life, however, than these kind of mystical experiences. Catherine actually ministered to the poor in very many ways. These show some pictures or indications of what she did. Notice over here on the far left, she took care of the sick. Remember, she lived during the bubonic plague. She wrote letters and visited the sick. She went to prisons. She engaged in all the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. She even wrote to political leaders of her time. And she even wrote to the Pope. I think we'd probably say that she was involved in social justice advocacy, even in her time, back in those centuries. She lived in a very violent time because the city-states were very often at war, so she was in the midst of that. But even though people thought she shouldn't be out there in the public and doing all these acts of mercy and so forth and so on, she just kept doing it. And she gathered a group of disciples around her that respected her and wanted to be part of her work. Sometimes she even traveled from one city to another or one city-state to another as an ambassador, and sometimes doing that for the Pope. Another time to just reflect a little bit. Are there any attributes of these two saints that you most admire? What traits do you see within yourself or within another associate that would connect to the mission of Catherine and Dominic? If the church recognized you as a saint, what would be your attributes or symbols? I want to think about that for a while. And you can certainly think about those questions even after you leave here today, if you want to jot them down. What do you admire about Catherine and Dominic? What might you like to imitate them in a way that we can do it in our 21st century? During the last years of her life, Catherine wrote a great many letters. About 400 of them survived. Now, I must also tell you, she was illiterate. So what she wrote, the different scribes would write them. She would dictate them to them. She also wrote what was called her dialogue. These are listed in that sheet of bibliography that's in your folder. She would have to dictate whatever she wanted to write or put down or have posterity see. She composed prayers, and these are also available. You can find these. Her spiritual advisor, who I mentioned before, it was Dominican Raymond of Capua. He actually wrote the hagiography that we've seen throughout this. And he's also, his book and his writings are on your the biography if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Catherine. By November of 1783, the Pope summoned Catherine to Rome. And there she spent what was the remainder of her life. She worked for the Reformation of the Church. She served the destitute, the afflicted. She detached letters to important people. She even took letters on behalf of the Pope then, who was Pope Urban, to people in high and low positions. The final 3 months of her life, as this picture shows, she was in constant pain, probably due to the type of life she led, the diet, the mortification, and so on. But she offered up this suffering for the unity of the church and for the world. In one of her final visions, she was said to say she saw the bark of Peter, or the ship of Peter, and that had been laid on her shoulders, and she felt crushed by its weight. That's why sometimes you'll see pictures of Catherine with a ship perched on her shoulders. Catherine died on April 30th, 1380, and we celebrate the feast of St. Catherine of Siena today on April 30th. A desire to be close to holy people was something very much part of the medieval mentality. So when Catherine died, there was a dispute about where her body would be buried. Siena, her hometown, and Rome were both wanting the body. So what happened was the uncorrupted head of Catherine is in the Basilica of San Domenico in Siena, and I saw that when I was there. It's there. It's not just fiction. But the body of Catherine is in a tomb in Rome in the Church of Saint Maria Minerva. We might want to do our final reflection on this question. Catherine and Dominic embodied the gospel in their day and time. How are we embodying the gospel in our day and time? Now, if you think back to the second slide, remember those pictures of people doing all different kinds of things? Our life is a preaching. We say that we preach from the pulpit of our life. So think about your own life right now. How are you preaching from the pulpit of your life and sharing gospel values in your everyday life? You might be doing it a lot more than you realize if you give it some thought. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. That might be telling me it's time, okay? I think I could share with you that Catherine and Dominic have impressed and impacted people for generations in their own time and in our own time. If you're ever able to go up to our chapel, and maybe some of you have been there, behind the altar, the large mosaic with all the Dominican saints, on either side of the crucifix are Dominic and Catherine. And we also know that Catherine was proclaimed a doctor of the church as a woman. There are very few women that have that title. Her life, her writings, her example. Saint Dominic, his life. We don't have many of his writings, but we have stories of him and biographies of him and so on. But certainly his work has impacted the world. The Order of Preachers just celebrated its 800th anniversary a year or so ago. We've been around for 800 years. And we continue to be around. And what's wonderful that's happened with the Order of Preachers that Dominic founded, remember it was the friars and the nuns and the Dominican laity, but now it's also the Dominican associates. You are becoming part of that family that Dominic founded. You are being called to preach. You are being sent forth daily to study, to pray, to be part of the community, and to minister. And your ministry, whatever it is, whatever you do, it's your preaching. So I hope today in these 2 hours, you've been able to learn a little bit more about Catherine. Maybe want to know more about her, because that's what the references are for. And then we'll give you some thought about what does it really mean to be an associate, and how can I be really connected to Dominic, our founder, and to Catherine, our most significant saint in the Dominican tradition. Thank you. God bless you. There you go.
I think you would join me in saying that Marilyn Jean may have gotten that material from Sister Susan Karina, but it took a lot for her to make it her own and to bring the light and spirit to the presentation. So thank you for your excellent presentation, Sister. I can attest to the fact that I visited her office many times this week, late at night, and she was working like a Dominican. Our October meeting is going to be a little different. In fact, it's the first time that we are doing this. As a Dominican Associate Director, I belong to 2 groups. One is the National Dominican Associate Directors, which are the Western and Eastern states, and one is the Midwest group of Dominican Associate Directors, and we meet 3 times a month. We would like to try this year to join the candidates together for one of the instructions. And so the October meeting is going to be a Zoom meeting, and you have the flyer in your packet. It's going to be given by a Sinsinawa sister, Sister Miriam Brown, and the title is Embracing Our Dominican Charism. The only thing that I'm concerned about is they're offering it for just the candidates, but it will be recorded. So when I get the recording, I will send it then to the sponsors to watch on your own. And then if you would connect with your candidates in between our meeting before November about what you heard in that presentation. So the group would like to do more together, because as our communities get smaller and our associates really become an important part of our future, then there will be less different communities. The communities that are represented in this are Grand Rapids, Adrian, Racine, Sinsinawa, the Peace Dominicans, and our Springfield Dominicans. So all those congregations are sponsoring this particular event. If you do not have access to Zoom in your own home, would you see me before you leave so that I can set something up with you here? Otherwise, individually, we would be doing it from our homes the next time, and I will be online also with that. So please note on that flyer that you do need to register for that event by sending it to Racine, and they will send you then the link. So we will meet again on November 7th for our formation session. After today, we're going to miss your not being here in October. Sister Karen Friend will present the history of our Springfield Dominican community. The small card that I placed in your packets today gives you a glimpse of that history as it's portrayed in the glass image that is in the front entrance as you come in by the switchboard. So sometime you'll have an opportunity to see that glass image if you have not seen it, but the card shows it to you. I want to thank our communications staff for all that they do for us to connect us with these Zoom presentations. And thanks to Sister Beth Murphy and to Aaron for giving us their Sunday by being present with us here. Special thanks to Sister Martha Marie, who prepared our snacks today and works for the setup of this room. So blessings to all of you. There is a paper on the end of the table that you came in where you received your packets, where we ask that our new candidates help with snacks. Maybe 1 month out of the 7 that we are meeting. There will be 3 times that we'll be providing the snacks here. But the snacks that you bring due to the COVID, you take back home if there's any leftovers, but we would share it here at this time. And please, it does not need to be a lot. It can just be 1 or 2 items to share with the group. And if more than one want to sign up for the same month, that's fine too. So again, thank you for your presence with us today, and thank you. I really look forward to journeying with you through this year. On Wednesday, we're beginning the season of fall, hard to believe. So blessings to each of you as we move into this colorful season. And as with all our seasons, fall is among God's many gifts to us. So we leave with grateful hearts today. So blessings on your month ahead, and we'll see you in November. Thank you.